This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? Tonight I'm going to be talking to Bernie Taylor, and he is the author of a book called Before Orion, Finding the Face of the Hero. And it's a different take on cave art and the myth, the hero's myth that you find throughout time. You still see today. He uses Star Wars a lot as an example, but you can see it in all kinds of stuff. It's a very archetypical idea that pops up again and again. So we're going to discuss all of that. We're going to look at his thoughts on things like the Orion Correlation and Hamlet's Mill and other stuff like that, as well as how we might communicate with someone from 12,000, 20,000, 30,000 years ago using sign language. So it's an interesting conversation. You can find his stuff at beforeorion.com. And without any further ado, here's my conversation with Bernie Taylor. All right, Bernie, welcome to the show.
Seriah, thanks for having me on tonight.
Absolutely. You had sent me over a talk you did, and it was really interesting. We're going to be talking sort of like on the ancient mysteries, an ancient astronomy sort of idea here. Can you tell people a little bit about yourself and how you got into this?
Absolutely. This book we're going to kind of glance across tonight is Before Orion, Finding the Face of the Hero, which explores the origin of myths and how we found those myths into the night sky and how those myths contain biological knowledge as well as geographic information. It was a journey. It ties into the work of the Swiss psychoanalyst Jung, as well as Joseph Campbell. And the presentation that you referred to was at Institute for Astronomy at the University of Hawaii. And I gave that presentation to a room full of career astronomers. And they asked, at the end, someone asked a question. And what's unique about it is that I gave a presentation online to a group that I fall into the category of mystics. It was a podcast. And the first question was the same question. And everybody keeps asking the same question. And so that's what we're going to explore tonight, is that question. And let's see if we can come to some sort of resolution of how we can get there.
How did you get interested in this stuff?
Well, I see myself as a naturalist. I'm an outdoors person. And I've spent a lot of time in the woods and in the rivers and lakes and so on. And I got interested in the concept of animal timing. When did the deer rut? And when did the salmon run up the rivers and so forth? And I wrote a book titled Biological Time. It was a scientific book. And I came up with the concept, or actually I recognized the concept of why do salmon migrate at the same time. So all the salmon are early or late from one year to the next. But all are early or late together. And so are they following one smart salmon? And of course, the answer is not. It's the same way with migratory geese and other waterfowl, that they all migrate going later in synchrony. And so I actually figured that out. And then after I figured it out, I said, someone must have known this. And so I started looking up ancient indigenous calendars, and lo and behold, the calendars of people across the Americas, the ancient hunter-gatherer calendars, as well as those people in the Mediterranean, they had this tied up in their calendars. The calendars were all about when the plants and animals would be available to them. And so they migrated around to when they could find them, harvest or hunt them. And that was the second book, this titled Biological Time. And that was probably about 12 years ago. So I looked at the biological calendars of the ancients in the Mediterranean as well as people in the Americas. I found that they were telling the same story of when to find either to harvest or to hunt the plants and the animals, and typically some sort of migratory fish. And that started this off. And I said to myself, well, if people were doing it in the last few thousand years and it isn't contained in their calendars, perhaps they even had it further back in time, which sent me back to the caves in France, and specifically the cave at Lascaux. And Lascaux has this big megaloceros. It's kind of like it's mixed between a moose and an elk. It's huge. And it's in this image, there's 13 dots leading to a box, and it's billowing out steam, and it's got its full antlers. So it's telling us a time period in the fall when this is a rutting animal. And the nomenclature under this megaloceros was exactly the same as the calendar of how Native Americans hunted deer and elk, based on their own calendars. And so I took that concept and I wrote a book about it with other plants and animals. And I put it on the shelf for 12 years. And after about 12 years, I started to see other people were talking about the same stuff. And I saw some unique things on TV, and I said, maybe I need to look further into this. As I looked further into it, I came across this whole wealth of conversation that I had no clue of when I wrote Biological Time. And there's a common story, there's a common question. And you can imagine that there's three people on three continents, and you stumbled across them 400 years ago. And these people hadn't been in contact with each other, or their cultures hadn't been in contact for at least 12,000 years. And it asked the question, well, how do these people have common information? How do they have the same common stories? Well, you could say, well, they independently came up with the same story, possibility. You can say that there's the Akashic record, it's in the air, and some people are somehow just the information is floating around and they're downloading it, which is another popular idea. A more popular idea is that there's ancient aliens that have been seeding information around the world, especially about 10, 12,000 years ago. And that one has spawned many books and an incredibly entertaining television program. There's another one out there is very popular, is that there was a lost civilization 10 to 12,000 years ago, and they sailed around the seas and spread the story. Very popular story, and of course that becomes the story of Atlantis. And well, there's another perspective, how I see it, is that these three cultures, deep back in time, deep into the Paleolithic, tens of thousands of years ago, had been united in the same place. And that's where we're going to take this story today. And I'm not going to, I'm done with the aliens. I'm done with Atlantis and the Akashic record and the rest of it. And people can pursue those directions as much as they want. But now we actually have a story that we can pursue, that we can find answers that make absolute sense and that we can see them. And that place we're going to go is into northern Spain in a cave called El Castillo. It's near the Bilbao region. So in this cave, there's a panel called the Gallery of Discs. It's about 10 meters across, which is about 30 feet. And it has these red discs streaming across. And it's about 80 or 90 discs in total. And each disc is a little smaller than the palm of your hand. And millions of people have gone and looked at this panel, both face to the panel, as well as seen it in the media, whether it be the Wall Street Journal or Science, Nature, Smithsonian, and they saw the images online. And they looked at this panel, and everybody was actually captivated with the red discs, and they counted them, and they figured out how each one was made, and that was where the story ends. And this panel had been seen more than 100 years ago. So I started in the exact same place. I counted the discs, and I said to myself, this is kind of interesting. This panel is 10 meters across, and the most common animal being in the Paleolithic record is the horse, and typically a pregnant mare. Maybe somewhere hidden in this panel is a pregnant mare. So I started looking. And in that panel, I found an elephant right away. Like within minutes, I saw an elephant. And then I saw two human beings, one speaking to the ear of the other. I saw the head of a lion. I'm like, whoa. It wasn't until 3 years later I actually saw the horse that I was looking for. And in fact, it was a pregnant mare. And that's kind of kicks off that astronomy video that at the University of Hawaii that's on YouTube. Right. And beforeorion.com is easy place to find it. So where does the common story come from? Well, the common story is when we go look at this panel, we can actually see characters. And on one end, we have this man holding an egg, and his left hand is feathered, and he's wearing a mask. And off the mask, one side has an eye, and the other side has a bird's beak. And then next to him is an actual eagle, and then we have this horse, and then we have a dolphin. We have a seal. Then we have another man at the end, and above them we have a Barbary ape, and we have the lion. Then we have these bears. And what these are, they're all there's constellations, and there's many other constellations on that panel, and they're actually the exact same order and animal beings as the Greeks saw the constellations. And so the one man at the end with the mask on his head is Hercules, and at the other end of the panel, at the far end, is Orion. And Hercules is a northerly constellation, is Orion to the south. And at that time, 34,000 years ago, when this panel was actually etched and drawn and painted, when Orion was on this horizon, also was Hercules. Okay, and when one rose, the other set. So it's almost as if they found these constellations in the night sky. Orion obviously looks like a human being, whereas Hercules doesn't. Mm-hmm. And so they invented Hercules to find the counter of Orion. And how, as it turns out, is that there's a story, and the story is of the man that who goes on a journey, and from the north end of the panel, where the Hercules all the way to the south, there's a giraffe down there. There's two giraffes, which tell us that that's in Africa. So it's a man that goes on a story, this journey across time and across space, because he's traveling across the land where he finds all these animals, and across the water he finds the dolphin and the seal, and then he ends up in Africa where these African animals are. And so we have a story. We have a story of this hero's journey, and he's traveling from point A to point B, and then he goes back again because he turns around to see Ursa Major in the night sky again, which indicates north. So what we have is this story of the constellations and people navigating time and space by the constellations, and that the story includes this hero who goes on the journey. And that's the three stories that you'll find in Africa and Siberia and the Americas. The animals might change a little bit because, they didn't have, I don't know, maybe there's not Iberian lynx in this panel when they didn't have Iberian lynx in South America. So the animals change. But the fundamental story is the same, as that a person goes from point A to point B back again. And on that journey, the person learns about their world. And then they come to face themselves, and they're given the support of the animal beings or mystical characters. And that's the fundamental story. And so could people have independently come up with that story? Yeah, maybe. But the deal is that in Siberia, Africa, and the Americas, they have an Orion character. And they have some of these other characters too. That Sirius is a dog in all three places, for example. Mm-hmm. And so there's multiple, and Ursa Major isn't typically an animal. It could be a reindeer or a bear, but it's most commonly a bear. And so we have these characters on three continents and disparate points of time. So yes, they could have all looked in the night sky and seen a bear, and not likely that it came out of some record in the sky. You didn't have ancient aliens to tell them, to find these constellations. If you had ancient aliens, you'd probably told them a lot more than constellations. And right? You didn't need a lost civilization to travel around the world 12,000 years ago, because these images go back to 34,000 years ago. So it goes back tens of thousands of years before there were any we have these so-called lost civilizations. And so we can go to a point that, perhaps the people in the Americas, they physically didn't come from this place in Spain, or to, well, I believe the story originated in West North Africa, but they intersected with people who did. And so there was cultural mixing, and that cultural mixing carried on these stories. So they're not DNA stories. They're stories of traditions that it's a great story. You can see it in the sky. And as you travel over time, the stories kind of morph a little bit. And so the person it's typically it starts off with a teacher and apprentice. In fact, it's almost always a teacher apprentice. And when the person goes on the journey, they encounter other beings. And so it's this can all exist with a common place from at least 34,000 years ago. Seriah, am I like cracked up on this one? Where are you?
No, you're good. And I feel like that is the most likely scenario, that these things are covered across time. But it could be like why did they decide on these animals? I guess is how do you think this whole thing came together?
Well, actually, the animals are interesting because all the animals on this panel of discs, or this gallery of discs, are located on the panel where they are geographically located in the real world. So on one end of the panel, we have this speckled mare, and we have Iberian lynx, whereas the other end, we have a giraffe. And between them, we have the seal, and we have the dolphin. So this person traveled across land Spain, then swam across the Strait of Gibraltar, which lands them in Western North Africa. And in Western North Africa, you also find there's a mongoose, and the lions there are actually African lions have a big mane versus the male has a big mane versus in Paleolithic in Europe they did not have big manes. At least the other images don't have them as big manes. This is kind of a unique image. You got this line so it's a place where the earth and sky become one. So the animals that they found on the earth, their psyches projected those images into the stars, which gave us the constellations. But it's the same constellations the Greeks have and the Babylonians have. So what happened? Well, this is what I believe happened. I believe they went to the caves. I believe that the Babylonians, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans, they went to these caves and they saw these images. And they found, so they saw the characters. And, the fundamental stories stay the same, but they told it with slightly different variations. And so the seal becomes a sea monster. Cetus is the constellation Cetus. And so the Greeks said, it's probably more interesting we tell this as he encounters a sea monster than he does the seal that we see up there. And in the middle of the night, if you went to the beach and you heard a seal, the first thing you probably were thinking was, this isn't a seal, this is a sea monster. Sort of like all the Bigfoot people when they hear things in the woods. A squirrel just became a beast when it's pounding around in the bush. So they changed the stories a little bit, and I can look at these different characters in the panel, and I can see all the different stories as people had modified them over time. And prior to this program, we had this kind of points about, well, how come we can do this, but chimps can't do this? Which is kind of so how which really also asks the question is, at what point in the evolution or transition of man did we come to be able to do this? Because chimps can't do this. Chimps can't tell the constellations. There are birds that can identify, kind of like they can cue in on a star, and they can use that for navigation, but they can't predict that the star is going to be there. Well, fundamentally, chimps can't make art. If you take a chimp, a mature chimp and highly intelligent, can use sign language and teach its young sign language, can do lots of tricks, but it can't paint. And if you put paint in its hand and have them do what it can, it's going to look like the finger painting of a 2-month-old. Whereas elephants, you've probably Google elephants painting, you'll see it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty abstract art. Abstract art, but elephants are painting other elephants holding flowers. I mean, it's pretty amazing. So hypothetically, an elephant could recognize constellations, and it's possible. Whereas a chimpanzee can't, because a chimpanzee can't project an image into the cosmos. A chimpanzee looks at Orion and the stars and just going to see, wow, this is, lights, right? More lights. Whereas an elephant could possibly recognize a constellation, and we certainly recognize the constellations. We recognize the patterns. So it's not just all these lights in the sky for us. How minds see the boxes and the circles, and we can find people and seals and horses and dolphins and all these lions and of course the bears in the night sky. We have that unique ability. Actually, we and elephants have that unique ability. And by our having that ability, being able to project our psyche into the cosmos and recognize patterns, we can then tell the seasons of the year. And we can say that when these stars are in the night sky, it's springtime. And we start to lose those stars and other stars arise, that's the summer. And we can take these constellations and then tell a story throughout the year, through the year of the stars, about a person that goes on his journey, and he's traveling through the night sky. And that those stories of the constellations are a reminder of who we are and what's important to us in life. And not just about how to find food and all that sort of stuff, but they tell us that there's a cycle of the year. They tell us that there's going to be a winter, and in that winter there's hardship. But if you get through these certain stars and you follow the stories, you'll make it into the spring. And again, those are common themes of stories that we find throughout the world. They're let's say, European contact type of stories. Can you think of any story in your past about sort of like this hero's journey? Does any come across that you come across?
Oh yeah, all the time. You mean like hearing stories that follow that idea?
Well, the myths, the myths, or it could be on the big screen.
Yeah, well, obviously, you talk about it in the other one, Star Wars being the obvious one. I mean, the nod to Joseph Campbell there is strong. The thing I usually think of actually is professional wrestling tends to do this. They set out their hero with the sort of quest. They don't tend to do it very well most of the time, but I'm not even sure they realize they're doing it. But that's kind of what it is. They take one guy and it's his hero's journey up to the top, fighting off the villains and such.
Exactly. And so we use this hero's journey commonly in media, and we tell stories to our kids. I don't want to say it's like a cliche, but it really is. But it's something that's in us. And what these myths do to us is they bind us together. They give us a common purpose. So there could be people all around the world who believe in a common myth that have never met each other. They could believe hypothetically, they could believe in Star Wars is true. Mm-hmm. And that could become their religion, their myth, their mythos. And that could bind them together throughout time. And so what these myths do for us is they give us a common tribe. Whereas otherwise, we're just, bands of people fighting with each other. And maybe we're still bands of people fighting with each other, but we have some common belief. And so these myths are so important to us. And these myths of the night sky that people across continents can connect with give us a common point of origin, a common language, and a common identity. And so if you had, Chief Sitting Bull had met a Saharan Tuareg, they can sit next to each other and look at the night sky, and they could come up with fundamentally the same story. They could identify with it because they encountered those stars in the same way. The stories were slightly different, but it was a common identity, a common myth. I mean, they could point to, say, Orion is the hunter, and they could point to Sirius as the dog. I mean, can you imagine that a native Sitting Bull and a Saharan Tuareg having that commonality when there's no DNA connection? So there's a common myth that we can see a man in the sky, and that one star that follows him is a dog. And that's incredible. And I believe that is one of the things that make us uniquely human. What separates us from the chimps is that we have this common story. You're not going to get a chimp to believe that there's a dog in that star following the guy, and that he should hang around a few more weeks to see what happens in the story with some other stars as they encounter that. It's not going to happen.
Right.
You might be able to, urge an elephant to do this. It's possible. um, I'd kind of be curious if you had a storyboard, if an elephant could actually follow the storyline. That would be fascinating.
Yeah, of course, we can't communicate with them to know.
Well, we can't communicate them visually, but the elephants, since they can draw, and so they can actually recognize themselves. If you had like a storyline of an elephant walking down to the water and drinking from the water, and then lifting its trunk up and blowing the water, would they recognize that as a storyline? So that would be I'm going to email to these people in Southeast Asia who are doing all the elephant stuff and ask them that question if they've have they ever asked, put the images together, the elephant, because they have elephants picking up flowers, and of course the flowers are at least the size of the elephant, but they have that ability to project their psyche beyond what a chimp can do, which looks independent. People have been testing this concept of what animals can paint, and there's one on YouTube about dolphins, and I tell you what, if two dolphins can recognize what the other did in painting, I'll eat my hat, I'll eat this mic, I'll eat anything, because I'm looking. He's like, and it's kind of cool. You get the dolphins, painting, and if anybody's going to tell me that two dolphins recognize the same painting, I don't see it.
I would think their way of viewing the world, however, would be very different from ours anyway.
Yes, yes. So dolphins can communicate, highly intelligent animals, but the elephant has crossed the line, and when the elephant crossed the line, and elephants travel for hundreds of miles throughout the year. In fact, there's still elephants in the Sahara traveling around. They go for weeks without water. I wonder if you could actually communicate with the elephant, have a storyline, and then elephants can establish a mythos, this a common identity that the identity of the elephant holding a flower, and that makes them uniquely compatible in that they're two herds of elephants are not at odds with each other. And that's what I think that's so. If we go back in time, we're going back 34,000 years ago to this cave in Spain, and there's other caves as well in France and Spain that have these images, and we find this common story, the story that's within us all. And what's really interesting about this story is that it's the characters are superimposed over each other. So he'll draw the artist draws the man, and he draws the eagle over the man, and then he draws etches the horse over both of them. So what we have is a man that transforms himself into a bird, which is like a shamanic ritual throughout the world. Everywhere you go, and if you go throughout antiquity in the Mediterranean, greater Mediterranean region, you'll find these men with the mask, the Anunnaki, and Horus among the ancient Egyptians. Mm-hmm. There's a common symbol of a man that becomes a bird. So not only do we have this common story, the hero goes on his journey, but we have actual common characters. So that we have the man that the bird is actually overlapped on him. It's an eagle. It's a golden eagle. So he transforms into the bird, and then he's overlapped with the horse. So he becomes one with the horse, which becomes which being in Greek mythology?
The centaur.
The centaur. Exactly. So where did the Greeks come up with the centaur? And why did the Greeks believe that there could be centaurs? Because they looked at this incredible image and others like it from way before their time. And they said, oh my God, and these are so lifelike. There were centaurs. And they came up with stories of centaurs. And then what happens, you have another man, he overlaps that of the dolphin. So he has the dolphin tail. And of course that is the
mermaid.
The mermaid.
Or the merman.
The merman, that's exactly it. Among the Irish, they say the silky, and I believe that's gender neutral. So
okay, all right.
I actually didn't know. I didn't know the correct answer for that. I was kind of see if you knew. But let's go with the merman. So we have a merman. We have and which is it's fascinating. And so we have these characters that we ordinarily think of mythical or monsters or whatever the heck they are, and they're in the Paleolithic record from tens of thousands of years ago, and these stories are told in other places. So the Irish, of course, have the mermaid as well. They call it a silky, so we have these phenomenal characters that transcend time and space. And
now some of these characters, though, and I forget how to say the thing properly, but the man-animal hybrids are also an altered state sort of thing that you would get out of shamanism.
So this is how I've deeply considered this one. Now they're called therianthropes.
Okay. That's it. Yes.
Okay. Now in shamanic states, people act the roles of animals. And in Siberia, for example, the most common animal that they act is a horse. Okay. So we have this man who has integrated with the man-horse centaur is really a common shamanic dance in the Siberia. And then the man transforms himself into the bird, which is another common shamanic experience. They do a dance where they put on the mask and so forth. And the mask or the transformation of the bird or the bird man, this avianoid, helps them to communicate with this other world. And that of course, is Horus among the ancient Egyptians. So it's an alternative state of consciousness, correct? And you can reach that through many different ways. And the most common way around the world with shamanic peoples is the drum. And second is the dance. And then after that, you have many different ways different cultures do it. But the drum and the dance are typically the core of the experience. Drum, dance, and chanting, those three. And so does the person, so I would agree that the hero that goes on his journey as he mixes with these animals, he's going into an alternative state of consciousness. Because the same way that we go to look at Star Wars, and Luke rides imaginary, unimaginable creatures, and he fights with a yeti in a cave, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we see that, we consciously we buy into it. It becomes our story, our myth. And think about Harry Potter, right? Have you ever walked out of Harry Potter and say, I didn't really buy into that? But you walk out of Harry Potter and you say, if I had encountered the werewolf, I would have probably done something different, or I didn't like that witch because she kept turning into an owl, or whatever the story was. Mm-hmm. So we that is in some ways an alternative state of consciousness, just as the shamanic character transforms himself into the bird or the horse, or or he blends in psychologically, into the seal to become the mermaid, the mermaid, or with the dolphin. So yeah, but we do it today. And when you go to what is it? The movie. One of them has Pegasus. That when you walk into the theater, and when the lights go up for the movie company, the winged horse Pegasus is the first thing you see, and Pegasus is taking you on a journey into your imagination. And that symbol of Pegasus is really the eagle. So we said that the man overlaps with the horse, but so does the eagle, and that gives the horse wings. So Pegasus is that constellation. And so we actually, at the beginning of the journey, is the beginning of the movie that we encounter Pegasus, and we go into the world of imagination. And that's a story. So that's a story so of course the movie people took Pegasus from the ancient Greeks, and the Greeks took it from these Paleolithic people tens of thousands of years ago. So we're still telling the same story tens of thousands of years ago. And we didn't need ancient aliens to tell us, or the Akashic record, or independently come up with, and we didn't need Atlanteans to spread the word. It's because we all came from the same place that we can tell the same story. And when we hear the story, we can identify with it. And that's the most important. And that gives us this common myth that we can rally around, so that we don't our tribe is more than 5 or more than 50 or more than 100. And we can communicate with peoples across continents.
So, sorry. The concept of these starting in one spot. How far back do you think that goes?
So I think this is where it gets interesting. So these cave images are about 34,000 years ago, and there's a few panels on different caves that are fundamentally the same story. Now, these individuals, they went to Africa. They went to West North Africa, and at that time, West North Africa was a savanna. It wasn't the Sahara that we see today. And in the Greater Sahara region, there's a rock art of hippopotamus and giraffes and crocodiles and all these water-based animals. And so these people did go to Africa because the image is just too exact. It couldn't have been how the geometry and the taxonomic details of these animals, they had to have seen them. And they probably were going back and forth. So what happened about a year and a half ago is there was a find in Jebel Irhoud, which is Morocco. And the find was in dating of Homo sapiens that goes back to 300,000 years ago. And that became the oldest record that we now have of Homo sapiens. Okay, and we used to. So when before that, we were going by the DNA record of Ethiopia, which is 150,000 years ago.
Right.
So now, and it was like it came out. No one was expecting this one. So we have this story of a man that swims across to go to Africa, and I'm going to tell you, this thing's going back 300,000 years. And there's something in the book which I don't talk about any podcast, and I'm not going to start today. But there is a point of origin that these images do not they don't come from Spain. They come from Western North Africa, and they come from a place not too far away from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. So there is a common point of origin where we made that connection between the earth and the sky. And it's fascinating. It's but and it's in the last chapter in the book. And the reason I don't talk about it is that people have to take the journey. So I'll put it on the air tonight if you can promise me one thing.
What's that?
If someone ever defrosts a caveman from 34,000 years ago, I get to be the first one to go talk to him. Can you promise me that?
Sure, if that could ever happen.
Well, if you can't promise it now, I'm not gonna tell you where to tell this story. People can read the book, and there's plenty of material out there even besides even reading the book. There's lots of I've given lots of presentations on different aspects of the book. Okay. So there's tremendous material out there to explore and learn about yourselves. Because your listeners tonight have just been exposed to something that they haven't heard before. And they've heard the other 5, right? The other 4. And the other 4 are, they do very well on TV and on YouTube and so forth. But now there's a different version. And it takes some time to set in that there can be a different version of the story. Even though that other version of the story seems to perceivably makes more sense. It doesn't involve any divine ET type of influence. So there's really a lot to manage. And here's something I do talk. I've done some presentations to people looking on YouTube. I talk about Picasso, and so is it possible that we can take information from the past and not even realize that we're doing it? And because first of all, we have to recognize, and even if we have seen the images in the past and that we don't make the connection to the future, well, Picasso did it. Picasso's first work of modern art was called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And what was unique about this painting in 1907 was he had 2 women had masks on them. And people said, Picasso, your career is over, it's ruined, and so forth. And someone said you want to find him hung behind his great canvas. And of course, we know the story of Picasso. It didn't work out that way. But there was something edgy about Picasso. And he went on to create all these creative images. They're absolutely phenomenal. And people said, well, where did they get those first masks from? Because that was the pivotal moment in modern art. And the common belief including genius Picasso series on National Geographic a few weeks ago, is that he found those masks in African art. Well, it's not true, because the two masks that he had in Les Dames d'Avignon are exactly the same as masks in the cave of Altamira in Spain. I mean, they're down to the detail, and people can look at the images on my sites and videos and so forth. I have some full-length Picasso videos on YouTube. So think about this. We have Picasso who sees it. Actually, many people had seen it, many people had photographed it, but they didn't make the connection that Picasso had actually borrowed those images, and they're exact. And he borrowed other ones as well to go on throughout his career. So there's been something that was right in front of us that was glaring us in the face, but instead of listening to Picasso, he said he didn't borrow it from African images, or he said he wasn't say where he was going to get it from. He borrowed it from because he was a businessman. He died with $30 million under his sofa or something. So Picasso borrowed this. He borrowed the metaphors. He borrowed the actual characters, and we didn't see it. So we can have this transfer of knowledge, this transfer of technology, with it being right in front of us. But we're so we want to believe something else. We want to believe what other people have told us, and we've heard it so many times that it becomes our myth. And the myth, of course, was that Picasso borrowed it from African art, which in fact was what Picasso didn't do, and Picasso said he didn't do. And now we can see that it came from another source. So it's fascinating that even in our modern time, we cannot see sort of this elephant in the room, and it's really sometimes hard to accept that the art historians completely missed it, and the archaeologists these are famous paintings, and these images in the caves, some of them pretty, they're well known. This isn't something someone just dug up and put on a shelf in a museum. Right. These are images that people have seen and continue to see. So we can miss the obvious. We can miss what's right in front of our nose. And perhaps sometimes to learn most about ourselves, it's no further than a feather that's blown from our own breath. Have you in your life, independent of what we've discussed in the last 40 minutes, have you come across something that you felt was like, we should know this, but we don't?
That's a really good question. I don't know.
Well, you've got a program, and you're coming across some interesting ideas.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're disconnected from a lot, honestly. I think that we had better connections possibly in the past, and that we saw things in a very different way. What do you make of archetypes and such?
So archetypes are important, and let me give an example. I live in Portland, Oregon, near the Oregon Zoo. It's a phenomenal zoo. When I go down to the lion cage, there's always a male lion at the top, and the females are just below him, and there's a younger male down at the bottom of the stack. And so we can say that that male lion it's a patriarchal society, right? He's
Sure.
patriarchal, and we can say that the lionesses are there to support him, and the juvenile lion, male lion, really isn't. The females are kind of just putting him down. You're just like, you're not ready for us yet. So we've just not those lions haven't had any association with the natural world for many generations. They're fed every day. Why do they have this hierarchical structure? Well, so lions, we say it's instinct, but it's really not. We carry these are archetypal. We've just said we've got the archetypal male, we've got the females, and we have the juvenile. So the lion who is to become king at that time. Well, this all makes sense in the out in the savannah of Africa, because the male lion, the lead lion, is the one who actually protects the turf, and the females go out to hunt, and then the females come back and first they feed him, and then they feed everybody else. So this all makes sense out in the wild. So somehow these lions keep these archetypal characters, and you could walk into that zoo and you can see these lions, and you can come up with pretty much the same story of the Lion King. and not just the story of the Lion King as, just that we have these three layers of lions, and there's probably within the females is some different personalities that you can actually find a story and tell about the juvenile that's he's watching the older lion, and he's somehow going to take his place, that the lion that will become king. So my position is that archetypes are within all animal beings, just as they are with us. And so when we see animals, we see the archetypes within them as we project our psyche onto them. So smart as an owl, a bull in a china shop, fast as a cheetah, or swift as a horse, or fly as high as an eagle. We see these animals, or these archetypes from the animals, the characteristics, just as the Paleolithic man saw them 34,000 years ago, and he took the strength from those animals on his journey. So is the Paleolithic mind from 34,000 years ago the same as it is today? Absolutely. So we're retelling stories with these same archetypes that are within us. The sets change, the costumes change, but ultimately it's the same story. And because these archetypes are within us, when the archetype is encountered, the story is evoked. Whether that be the story of the Lion King, the hero on his journey, or Luke Skywalker, who travels through space on this journey as well. In each place he encounters unique beings for each one, just as the hero does in the Paleolithic camel, in Paleolithic images. So how does that make sense? Is that a way of archetypes, an explanation of archetypes that you've encountered before?
Yes and no. I mean, do you think it's structured into our DNA then?
Remember I said that there was a question that was asked. There's one question that was asked.
Mm-hmm.
This is your first question tonight, isn't it? There's one question that was asked at the end of the Institute for Astronomy at University of Hawaii, and in the podcast of Mystics.
And what was that?
This is what you just asked.
Okay, all right.
The same question. So everybody's asking the same question, and I believe the answer is that it is structured into our DNA, because the lions here in the Oregon Zoo have no benefit to keeping that same structure, that same order. They're being fed. He doesn't need to protect the territory from anybody. The females don't need to go out and hunt, and the juvenile is destined to become king. so there's no biological benefit to do it, and none of those lions have ever encountered any animal from the wild, so-called wild, that had this behavior. So they're if you take a dog right away from its mother, and not encountering the mother, and you feed them, will the dog, and you raise a dog as in your home, will the dog continue to be a dog, or the dog become a human?
Fair enough. Fair enough. But
when the dog, if that dog, because you've seen this, you've had dogs that were taken away from other dogs, and then the first time they encounter a dog, they behave like dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we say that's instinct. Okay, but then when they encounter those other dogs, they have those same hierarchical dominance and all the other playfulness and everything else that you find among the lions in the zoo. And so I don't believe I believe that the so-called instinctual, what we call instinct, are really archetypes that are carried within the DNA, or within our collective unconscious within the DNA, and that's sort of as psychoanalyst Jung would have said, that the mechanism. Now I don't recall that Jung actually talked about lions and dogs and so forth, and that was bull in a china shop and smart as an owl. But the concept, he said it wasn't just instinct, but I believe that we do carry it in our DNA, and that was the answer they gave to these other groups. Now, there's the criticism of the collective unconscious. They say in the hero's journey and so forth, they say it's a social construct and blank, blank, blank. Well, there is a social construct component of the hero's journey. So Moana is fundamentally the same story as Hercules. Okay? Um, and Moana is a female and Hercules is a male. That's a social construct. So we in our modern time decided that the hero would be a female. That the Moana travels across, most of the journey is across water because it's in the whole the Pacific, Hawaiian Islands. Whereas in Hercules, most of he does travel across water, but it's land and water. So that again, that's a social construct based on the environment that the heroes are in. So we can say that there is a social construct of the whole thing, but fundamentally that hero's journey story is there, and that that the hero is an archetype. The hero encounters other archetypal characters such as the teacher and the helping lion and the dolphin. That the dolphin actually raises the Orion character above the surf, and that these are mystical characters. In the same way for Harry Potter, that the owl gives him messages, and his friends, or his friends don't turn to animal beings, but there's other Hogwarts teachers that do become therianthrope animals that give him assistance, and that becomes the same. And we accept those things, or these characters and these stories, because they're within us. And it's the same way that people accept. Obviously Bigfoot is this half man, this man beast, and we just because we haven't seen a Bigfoot doesn't mean that we can't envision that there is a Bigfoot, because these stories of the therianthrope are they're within us, that go back for tens of thousands of years. We can't escape them.
So there's also the concept that Rupert Sheldrake puts forward of the sort of morphogenic field.
Correct.
And that's how some of this data is transferred.
So that falls into the category of Akashic record without the Akashics, that he believes that So by the way, I have very high respect for Rupert Sheldrake. I've read his books. He is one of the most brilliant people on the face of this earth. And he challenges the status quo. And one of the things I love that he says is that, give me, he repeats one of his scientist friends that says, give me one free miracle and I'll explain the rest. Okay, because at the core of everything, we have these questions, and the questions, of course, is where does this collective unconscious, how does it carry from one being to another? And you asked the question of the DNA, which is how I believe it happened. So what Sheldrake he's suggesting is that that animals around the world will somehow keep learning from each other. So if there's the case of the rats in Australia had reached a certain degree of tricks, and then a few years later the rats in Europe took that level and went a step further. And he uses the example of SAT scores and other standardized tests. And I believe that what I like about Rupert Sheldrake is how he pushes the bar. In case of this morphic resonance, I don't believe it happens that way. And it kind of goes in the same category of the lost civilizations that crowd around the world, or the Akashic record. And I believe that there is this core knowledge that we've grown from. And I don't believe that there's a morphic resonance. But I would love to see more research done on that to change my mind, because I think it's a phenomenal idea. And just like my ideas, I'm pretty far out there too, because there's the independently came out the same story, the Akashic record, ancient aliens, lost civilizations. My battle is with these other common ideas that everybody's seen many times over.
Why do you think myths are so important to us?
Because the myths are what bind us together. So if the common myth, let's take a religious myth, and I won't point to any one specific religion, but we could have a religion where people on multiple continents have no contact with each other in the past few hundred years, but they fundamentally have that same story. And by that, following that same story, they can cooperate with each other. And so by people that normally can't speak to each other because they're too far from each other, too far, or can't communicate, now they can actually, they have a commonality, a common thing, idea that they can rally behind. And so the myths are what bind people together. But the myths, and that's what brought us forward. So in these caves in Spain and France, there's a common mythos of the hero that goes on this journey. And so for tens of thousands of years, the apprentices went in and they identified with the story. So even if the shaman dies prematurely, the apprentice can still go in and learn the story. And it was the same story that the shaman or his grandfather told him when he was young. So these myths have components for societal norms that give us something that binds us together. And that's why myths are, they're part of us. You know, democracy is a myth. You know, communism is a myth. Today, tomorrow's the 4th of July, and there's a lot of people who have different ideas about whether a democracy today or a tyranny. And whichever way you fall, we still gather around this common myth of a democracy tomorrow. And we will continue on. So we're not going to be tomorrow, we're not going to break off into these different bands, but we believe whatever political party you're in, that we're all going to come together. And we're going to follow that same myth, even if it doesn't work sometimes. And even if multi-billionaires control so much, it doesn't matter, because we're going to continue following that myth. Just as we follow religions for thousands of years, and we follow the story of the hero that we all come to be on our life's journey.
And that was a really awesome answer, by the way. What do you make of
But you still can't guarantee me that I'm going to be able to chat with the first caveman. That's my thing in life. I'm going to tell you right now.
Who knows what language you would speak, though?
Well, actually, I worked on the elements of a sign language in Before Orion. I've got about 20 characters that I'm pretty solid about.
And how did you figure that out?
Because they're all first of all, they're all animals. And there's nomenclature in different caves that's the same next to certain animals. And these nomenclatures tend to be next either hand like configurations of the hand, right, or series of boxes that are next to each other that actually look like fingers. And so how they did it was each animal has its own gesture. And you can imagine, you can gesture, you can do a rabbit, you can put 2 fingers up, right? Okay. Well, they didn't just go with 2 fingers for the rabbit up, but they would also move the other 2 fingers, the other 2 fingers on the hand, to be some sort of biological nomenclature. And so in the case of the horse, it's when it tells it's the nomenclature of when the horse drops its young. Okay, and I explain over many chapters in the book, and I show different examples and so on. And so there was a sign language that they carry throughout time. And all I have is about 20 animals, so I don't have any like verbs. But I do. But what each one of these signs do is they actually tell you the time, and they closely correspond to how Native Americans had their calendars. And so you could actually look. This is the moon. This is the moon when the deer rut, or when the mares drop their young, or when the auroch drops its young. Or the ibex drop the young. Actually, most of them about the dropping of the young set up the time period. So each hand gesture is actually a different time period within their calendar, which tells them where they're supposed to be and what they're going to see. But I don't have any verbs, so I could, that's a problem.
It's a start.
Yeah, it's a start. Yeah.
I never even would have thought of something like that. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, there's a book out there when it's out there. So you had a question. You were going on a question.
Yes. So, are you familiar with Hamlet's Mill?
Okay, so vaguely. And the last time I was listening to like a Graham Hancock podcast, and he talked about it.
Mhm.
Hamlet's Mill. And
And their idea is that the mythologies that we see are tied into the precession of the equinox and the keeping
yeah,
of that knowledge.
yeah. Okay, so I could actually speak to that. Yeah, I remember the story. Okay. Um, well, this Hamlet's Mill goes into the same concept of the Atlanteans, that they believe that people could tell the precession of the equinoxes, and they could tell back in time. Okay. And part of that is based on this concept that how people kind of justify it in modern times is that at Giza, the Sphinx faces towards the east. Okay. And so they say, well, obviously we can to find that same point in time, you'd have to go about 12,000 years ago, and that's when the Leo meets with the sun at the vernal equinox.
Right, and also when the three stars align with Orion.
And it's three stars of Orion. Yeah,
I'm sorry, the three stars of Orion and the three pyramids.
exactly. So I have like this bunk scale, okay, and the bunk scale, one is like, maybe it's possible, and 10 is totally bunk. It's a 10, and I'll explain why. So the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greeks and the Babylonians, they found these characters, these constellation characters, on these Paleolithic images. Well, the Paleolithic images weren't based on they actually designate time periods, because there's animals the animals in these images are at certain points in time. And so we have, for example, this juvenile eagle on one end of the panel gallery of discs, and based on the size and the plumage of the eagle, it's a mid-June time period. Okay, so it's not a vernal equinox time period. At the top of that panel, we have the lion. With the lion is Leo and the constellations of the whole thing. So what the ancient Egyptians did, and the ancient Greeks and so forth, they saw the images. They had no idea what time it was, because precession of the because they're not designed by the precession of the equinoxes. But what they did do is they arranged their architecture based on how they envisioned things should be. So the precession of the equinoxes is let's call it an ancient concept, whereas the images going back in the Paleolithic record, they're not about the equinox. The panel of discs, for example, is tied to the summer solstice or mid-June time period, when we can find, there's actually a number of animals that are midsummer animals, or at least the stage of the development is midsummer. So we can find that we now have the teacher's textbook, edition book, to all these monuments in the ancient world, at least in the Mediterranean, and we can look back to see, what people were thinking, and tie them back to the images. And they had no concept of the precession of the equinoxes 34,000 years ago, and even if they did, even if the Greeks figured it out to go back 34,000 years ago, it would have they would have goofed, because it wasn't the vernal equinox; it was the summer solstice. And it doesn't work. The timing doesn't work the same. So you just can't add 27,000 years or whatever, the precessional cycle, to go back in time. So the Hamlet's Mill is a very clever idea that assumes that there was that people in ancient times, and the origin of their art, which we now see as 34,000 years ago, understood the precession of the equinoxes. And the answer is no, because number one, they weren't interested in the equinoxes. They were interested in the summer solstice. And we can see that based on the animals. And so if you take that one out right there, everything else falls apart.
But when you're looking at the precession of the equinox, you're also looking at the change of the stars over long periods.
So with the precession of equinox, you're looking for when the same stars align at the same point at the vernal equinox.
Right.
Okay. So they weren't looking at the vernal equinox. So this Orion constellation theory with the Sphinx and so on is all based on the vernal equinox. So they created a model with a bunch of assumptions, and one of the assumptions, it's based on the vernal equinox. and it went back. So you could go if they had come up with, if they actually did off the summer solstice, which is what they're doing 34,000 years ago, where the origin of all this stuff is, they would have come up with a different date. But they wanted that date, which is like 10 to 12,000 years ago, because that ties into when Plato said there was a lost city of Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
So they've tied this whole thing up into a package to, number one, give you an Atlantean civilization that was, sailed around the world and spread all this knowledge that we now see we have an explanation from an earlier source, and that they understood these astronomical time periods that they could. You actually can't look into the if you look into the Paleolithic record. You look 34,000 years ago. It's actually a little tricky even to tell which constellation was. I can tell you it was a summer solstice time period because the animals, but I can't tell you based on the arrangement of these constellations which one was tied to the summer solstice, because it wasn't drawn out that way. And there's another problem. Here's an even bigger problem with the whole Hamlet's Mill and the Orion constellation theory, is that the constellations as we know them today are a modern invention. Ptolemy, the ancient Greek, who I talk about in the Institute for Astronomy lecture on YouTube, Ptolemy's constellations were actually mixed up, so they overlapped into each other. The modern boundaries of constellations came in the last few hundred years. It's a modern concept. So people who are trying to take these modern constellations and put them back to 5,000 years ago, much less 10 or 12,000 years ago, it doesn't work. And how they did the Paleolithic record was in the caves, is these constellations overlapped each other. And so that's how we have the Hercules overlapping with the eagle and overlaps with the horse, and which makes the Pegasus and the centaur. So they weren't clearly defined. The ancient Greeks and Ptolemy, they saw pictures in the night sky. They didn't see the groups of stars as we see them today. It's a modern invention. And I've done podcasts, and people say, Bernie, I really don't, other than Ursa Major and Orion, I really don't recognize any of these constellations. It's because that's not how they were originally found. So the modern constellations as we see them and we've come up with, it's a recent invention that we can't transpose back to the ancient Greeks. Actually, can't transpose in the ancient Greeks. We certainly can't transpose it into the ancient Egyptians, and we can't go back 34,000 years ago. What I can say is all these same constellations, all the same animals are in the same order as the Greeks found them, and that's you go through them one by one. There's a dozen or so. So we can say this was an origin of the Greek constellations, but we can't clearly define all the stars, and that's not how Ptolemy, who came up with the 48 constellations that we use today, the basic constellations, he didn't see all those stars. He saw pictures in the sky, and later they were broken up into actually the stars. So the concepts of Hamlet's Mill and Orion constellation theory and stuff, they, remember had the scale, the Bunk scale from 1 to 10? Mm-hmm. It doesn't work.
Okay. All right. Does it now? Go ahead.
It sells a lot of books, though. That sells more books than what I'm telling you.
I don't know that Hamlet's Mill actually sold a lot of books. I mean, that's a pretty old book.
But the following books did.
Yes.
Yes.
When you're looking at this, though, you are saying that basically these images are very similar throughout time. What the difference between modern constellations and the ones in the caves in France, for example? What are the differences that have changed with these constellations?
So so we have to look at the constellations both among the ancient Greeks, and actually the ancient Greeks and the ones of the Paleolithic record are actually quite similar, in that they didn't look at them as groups of stars. They saw them as pictures in the night sky. And there'll be a few stars, for example, the feet of Orion were important to them. The belt stars were the Paleolithic record has no interest in the belt stars of Orion. Neither did the ancient Egyptians, and really, it wasn't the big deal among the Greeks either. They're there, but it wasn't the showstopper. It wasn't what everybody was interested in. They were interested in the stars that were closest to the horizon, because that would tell them the heliacal rising. then everything else kind of, it's all, icing on the cake. What the ancient Egyptians were not, there's nothing in the ancient Egypt record that talks about the belt stars of Orion. It's a fabrication. And a few reasons that whole thing can be thrown out is other people say, well, it's Cygnus. And then they turned out to be a fourth pyramid that was dismantled, the so-called Black Pyramid. So there were four pyramids in a row, not three. And so, and then there were four big pyramids in a row. And then there's also a bunch of smaller pyramids, so-called Queen's pyramids on the Giza Plateau. But no one wants to say, well, where do they fit in? Because they don't fit in. And anytime you find three dots in a row, you can come up with anything you want. So some people come up with the belts of Orion, some people come up with Cygnus, and there's a bunch of other ideas out there. But we can see the origin. We can now see the origin of these Actually, if you even go back to the Greek record, it doesn't fit. But the Greek record does fit in with the Paleolithic images, and the same animal beings in the same orders, and that they do overlap, and they saw them as pictures in the sky versus specific constellations, specific stars that created body parts in the constellations.
So, and that was Andrew Collins who does the Cygnus correlation.
Correct. But everything's Cygnus, right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
And Cygnus is on this panel, by the way. It's a great auk.
Okay.
It's a great auk. I think so. Cygnus is tied to the cosmic egg, and I said that this Hercules character is holding the egg, and the egg comes from the great auk, which is right next to him. Okay. And how people would have looked at it was, the cosmic eggs is a singularity. We can understand that there's chickens and there's eggs, or there's auks and their eggs, and there's geese and their eggs. So, and you're going to choose the biggest egg that you possibly can find. So in Ice Age Europe, it would have been the great auk, and in Africa it would have been the ostrich, and someplace, in other places it might have been the goose, because the auks were all killed off and there were ostriches in some of these other places. So you really chose the biggest egg you could have, but you identify that constellation as a bird. And so sometimes it's going to be a goose, and sometimes it's going to be an auk, and sometimes it's going to be something else. What he has correct is that the constellation originated as a bird, and I can see it this 34,000 years ago, and that they saw that as an origin point. Okay, it wasn't an origin point. So the origin point was the cosmic egg itself. It wasn't the origin point in the cosmos itself. And when the cosmic egg opens up, everything else, it starts the whole cycle over again. And I said that there's a number of biological characteristics from the Gallery disk, and one of them is actually the egg with the great auk, because the great auk, lays its egg late May, early June. So we can again tie in the animal beings to tell us what time of year it was, through the great auk. So what's really cool about this, the cosmic egg being in this, and there's actually a man steals the egg in a separate image, and of course the Hercules character holds the egg. What's really cool about this is we have that's another common story that we find all around the world. And of course the ancient aliens people, theorists, they have a program that game over, because this is such a unique story. The Vedic people in Indus Valley, and the Norse people, and the ancient Greeks, and the Dogon, everybody's got the cosmic egg. Well, it just tells us again that we have a common story, a common myth, and that there was a singularity in the cosmos that created what we now come to be the Big Bang. It's the same story, the same myth.
So you're saying that they knew of the Big Bang when they created this?
Well, they didn't know the Big Bang, but how they made sense of their world was that before there was a chicken, before there was an auk, before there was an ostrich, before there was a goose, there was an egg. Okay. And so how they did, here's the difference, is that we now interpret that as a creation of the cosmos itself. But in their world, every year that this egg hatches, that's a new beginning. That symbolizes the beginning that's always been. So there's an eternal cycle of the cosmic egg. So it's not the beginning. It's not technically the beginning of the cosmos. But as we interpret it today, because we say there has to be a beginning, there has to be an end. But in the hunter-gatherer worldview, was that they were cyclical in nature. Now this is interesting. Okay, this is really so. This I think that we're like on the we're in the juice of the whole thing right now. Ready? Okay, so the Big Bang Theory, as we now know it, was a theory by Father Lemaitre, a Belgian priest, and Hubble later came out to observe an expansion of the universe, which gave us, well, now we have the Big Bang. But it originally came out through Father Lemaitre, and Father Lemaitre worked it out mathematically. And in Father Lemaitre's head, he's working on the idea of creationism. Now, he could never say that, but he worked out the math. And at that time, Pope Pius XII said, Lemaitre has proved that there was a singularity, a creation. Therefore, there must have been a creator. So the Big Bang, the formation of the Big Bang as we know it, whether or not it's correct physics, from the physics standpoint, I have no opinion. But the origin of the Big Bang came from a Paleolithic myth. And now we have multiple ideas of how the universe was founded. And one of the ideas, of course, is multiverse, which is really, you stack up a bunch of, instead of having one egg, you stack up a whole bunch of eggs. You crack a few so they're on different time periods. But so we're still tied to this Paleolithic myth. And so the Big Bangers, by the way, some say, well, maybe there was something before the Big Bang. Maybe there's something called inflation. And maybe before inflation, there was a universe before that then, it contracted into becoming, so now we're in expansion. Well, maybe something in the past contracted, became that singularity, then exploded again. But we're still trapped in that Paleolithic myth of this cosmic egg. Because it's what we can understand. It's the same thing as saying a bull in the China shop or fly as high as an eagle. We carry these archetypal ideas, which the cosmic egg is, and now the latest iteration of it is the Big Bang. Doesn't mean there wasn't a Big Bang, but the concept goes. We can take it directly back to the person who came up with it. Was Father Lemaitre, and Lemaitre was influenced by the concept of creation. And he came up with a mathematical formula to prove it. Lemaitre came out and said, no, this is, I really wasn't thinking about creation. I just came out with the math. BS. Because it was in his psyche. He can't escape from a creationism. That's what he knew. And so he built a model around that creationism. And for many years, the scientific community did not accept Lemaitre's his theory. It wasn't even after Hubble came out with the expansion universe, they still didn't accept Lemaitre's theory, because the scientific community said, well, we're just reinventing creationism. But today we commonly accept the Big Bang as a scientific theory, but we also have these other theories such as the multiverse.
Right.
And where do you stand on the Big Bang and the multiverse?
I actually lean more toward the electric universe idea.
Do you? Okay, which is cool. And what I really appreciate is people that are getting out of these archetypes. Okay. Yeah. And they're saying, maybe it's something completely different than we ever could have imagined.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what I like as well.
Yeah.
I'll always lean toward the underdog theory.
Yeah. And of course the Big Bang was an underdog theory for a while.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
We are just about out of time. So tell people where they can find out more about your work.
Sure. My webpage is beforeorion.com. I use #BeforeOrion on everything. There's lots of great YouTube videos. I use beforeorion.com as one word. You can find them. I'm on Instagram, some images as Before Orion. Facebook is Before Orion. And I'd love a few more Twitter followers at Bernie Taylor OR. So BernieTaylorOR. The book is available in ebook formats, where every ebook format that exists around the world. You can push a button, you can get it. And what's really cool is that it's full color book, a full ebook, and you can zoom in and out to see the images. And it's a $9.99 on Kindle. If this as a print book, it would have been about $60. And so this is the age of let's save some trees.
Yeah, definitely. And what do you have? What do you think you're going to be working on next?
I'd love to do a documentary.
Hmm.
And so I'm reaching out to different places to find those connections. It's a visual book. It's a it's made for Disney or or some sort of documentary series. It's a incredible story, and we can see it. And it's a story that's within us all. You want to produce it, Seriah?
I think I have enough on my plate at the moment.
Okay.
But thank you very much, Bernie. It's been a great conversation.
Lots of fun. Let's do it again.
All right. And a special thanks to all of my Patreons, and particularly those pledging $10 or more for the extra support: Super Inframan, Andy McNamara, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, Allison Cook, Craig Cisneros, Donna Beveridge, Sasha Lorg, Christopher Vaughn, Robert Groom, Scott Morris Everett, Chris Elmquist, Russell Wilcoxon, Patricia Giaquinta, Matthias Sumby, and John Eddy. Thank you all so much. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.